sometimes when I tell you at 11:13 I don't know what question I'm going to ask you, I do it so that I hope by 11:15 I will know what question to ask you. Because there's a question I want to ask, but I think it might make me sound a bit stupid. What do you mean it's too late to start worrying about that? The question I think I am going to ask this, and actually it does apply to the slaver descendant as much as the slave descendant. So the Gladstones have spoken of their desire to go to Guyana to say sorry. He found out about his family's slave owning policy. See, there it is. You are, as the 2 times great grandson of a former prime minister, didn't even know that his dad owned 2,500 enslaved African people in Guyana and Jamaica. Didn't even know, because it's like this. It must have become a taboo so quickly, mustn't it? It must have gone from everybody being at it to everybody. It's going to be like Brexit one day. No one will admit they voted for it, in the same way that presumably within 20 or 30 years of the Slavery Abolition Act, no one admitted that they were filling their boots while it was legal. So he's talked about his shock. He said, I felt absolutely terrible. I really, really hated it. It was a shock and I felt absolutely sick. Slavery is a crime against humanity, and to have someone in the family involved in that is horrendous. And Gladstone even defended his father's slaveholdings during his early years in Parliament. So the family have now given £60,000 to fund a post to research the slave trade at University College London, £100,000 to set up a research department at the University of Guyana. They plan to make a formal public apology at the opening of the new International Institute for Migration and Diaspora Studies. And they join a growing list of descendants of slavers who feel it is their place and their duty to atone and apologise for the actions of their ancestors. He said, through this apology, I want to say to other families and other institutions, you can do this. And it's incredibly worthwhile for the people that you do it with. It's a game changer. And that's the question. How does it change the game?
Okay. Yeah, I think that they should be compensating the descendants of slaves and also doing something for the countries where they had slaves.
I get that. And when I say why, I'm not asking it from an aggressive perspective. Because I see the natural justice argument. How can you possibly give money to the owners and not to the owned? But in context of your feelings in 2023,
yeah,
why would the reparation element be important? What would it change?
Because I think that it's affected the lives of the descendants.
Yes.
And I think it's impacting the young people even up to today. You know, you see all these, and you might say it's a different argument, but I just think that, you know, there's not things in place for young people, and that, you know, they're out there in the streets causing havoc because they've not had the advantages. And the psychological history as well, I think, is something that needs to be better explored and better understood for the reasons that you allude to. And you know, that notion of equality. Can you ever feel truly equal in a country where your great-great-great-great-grandfather was owned by somebody else's? And you both walk in the same streets today? I don't know. That's why I'm asking the question, and it's why I keep stressing that I'm not really qualified to provide answers.
It is a very, very complex issue. On the one hand, we've got the deniers who say it's 400 years ago, move on. You know, there's nothing to complain about. Why has every other oppressed group managed to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and get on with it? But what's not being examined is the deep-rooted trauma collectively in people of African descent, and the displacement that took place, the divide that is still there to this day between, say, for instance, people from Caribbean heritage and people from directly from Africa. All of those divides were driven and rooted in by the transatlantic slave trade. If you imagine you have an individual victim, for instance, who, let's say that individual has been raped, if I can use that word on radio.
Of course you can,
let's say, for instance, that has happened. You then uproot that individual and put them next door to their rapist and expect them to thrive, to psychologically overcome the trauma, and to become functional members of society. It's impossible. So what you've got is slavery, neo-colonialism, and the overspill of ghettos, if you like, in the West. Because one of the things that I've been examining recently, James, as well, if the issues that we have in the UK, the US, and places like that within black communities are specific to black communities, why do we not see them replicated in Africa, for instance, and other parts of the Caribbean? Do you see what I mean?
Of course I do, and I see the converse as well, which is the kind of problems that you're alluding to, commonplace among the white working class in Glasgow.
Absolutely.
So it's clearly not. Well, you know that racists want to impute criminality to DNA. That's how they justify stop and search. It's how they. It's how they stay employed in some cases. But talk to me about the difference that these conversations make. So let's actually specifically on the Gladstone family. Does that make any difference to you?
Well, the fact that the Gladstone family have decided to reach out.
Yeah, to acknowledge and atone and apologise.
I think it does make a difference. I mean, obviously, if you're a victim of any kind of crime and the perpetrator reaches out and apologises and shows some sort of remorse, it's going to have an impact, isn't it?
I hope
but
so.
They're not direct perpetrators.
Well, no, that's the point I was about to make. And I think it's a really important point because, I can see on a systemic social level the importance of apologising for what our forebears have done. But I wouldn't hold you responsible for your great-grandmother being a drink driver, for example.
Well, that's the point I was going to go on to make, is that, individual families making apologies, that's all fair and well, and it's great on one level, but this needs to happen at a governmental level. It needs to happen globally. It needs to be taken up by the United Nations, actually. That's what should be happening, and there does need to be some sort of effort towards reparation for those countries. Do we give those reparations to
why reparations
African
for those
nations?
countries? Well, yeah, but also why reparations for those countries? Because Anthony and Croydon picked up on this as well, where I was thinking, perhaps lazily, more about some form of reparation for the actual individual descendants. But that would be almost impossible to police, wouldn't it? The bureaucracy of it.
That's the point, isn't it? We're talking about millions upon millions of people. I think that if there were individual reparations, it would either be a sum that was an insult or sums of money that would bankrupt the West.
Yeah.
So I don't think that's feasible. I think it does need to be managed. It does need to be managed through countries in Africa or West Africa, or wherever.
Yeah, but the problem,
and more importantly, the Caribbean and South America, where those slaves were taken, and where we ended up. So the UK, the US, those communities, but it has to be very, very carefully policed. What we have as a result of neocolonialism is corrupt governments that are allowed to run with impunity across whatever region. There's no checks and balances, so that's not a good idea. The other problem you've got is the notion of societal equality. So what you are moving towards is an acknowledgement of epic, ingrained, centuries-old inequality. But this is currently a country where even the head of the Metropolitan Police won't use the phrase institutional racism because he's worried it might upset his own officers. So the the struggle is real, isn't it? Getting that notion across. You talk about white privilege, and people who have got a fairly rubbish life say, well, I've got not got any privilege. What are you talking about, white privilege? And either they are willfully not understanding or they genuinely don't understand. It's not a denial of their problems or prejudices they've faced. It's just an acknowledgement that there is one prejudice they don't face. And the struggle you have even getting words into the public vocabulary like that, never mind the financial element that you're alluding to. But, I mean, that's it, isn't it? The bigger the mountain, the more important it is that you start climbing.
I was just talking about some of the emotional effects of slavery that are not being discussed. I mean, one of the most effective things, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Barbados Code, but actually what they did was learn how to destroy the family so that men were used for breeding, as were women. And it was a highly effective capitalist system because you had almost free labor and you could create new labor as you wanted it. And one of the major problems with that is you had to destroy the identity of the people that you were working with. And we still live with that today. I grew up in a society in Jamaica where literally you were told if you're white, you're all right. If you're brown, stick around. If you're black, stand back.
Gosh.
And that was within a black-dominated society.
Yes.
So I think the emotional and social scars go very, very deep. And I think you also need to be really cognizant of the fact that Britain has profited hugely from the islands and has also done an awful lot to destroy. And one of the reasons that Britain moved out of it was the level of rebellion that actually went on. The Gladstone, the revolt in Ghana was led by Jack Gladstone. and his own father was hung on a gibbet and allowed to rot in order to frighten the other slaves. So that the history of rebellion and the fact that slaves knew about other rebellions in the Caribbean was one of the reasons that Europe got out of the Caribbean. It was also the reason that beet sugar was so welcome, because all of a sudden they didn't need cane sugar anymore. So there are huge economic and social reasons for what happened, but we paid a price in terms of our self-image, our self-esteem, but of course also our wealth. And the fact that we are tiny islands, we're very vulnerable, and unless we are protected in some way, which is what China is doing now, we are at the mercy of larger economies.
Can I ask you on a personal level how you feel when stories like the one about the Gladstone family are made public this week?
My most cynical response is, isn't it interesting that they've gone to Ghana, which has just found oil wealth and is not going to need their money, and they haven't gone to Jamaica, which is suffering in all sorts of other ways and would need the money? That's my cynical response. But I also think it's tremendously important that the people of England understand what slavery entails, not because they need to feel guilty, but because they need a true understanding of their history. And once they've got that, then what happens is I think you begin to have more equality and more equality of opportunity.
Well, that leads us into territory that we explore often on this programme from all manner of perspectives. And there, of course, are plenty of people who don't want more equality, aren't there?
Of course, because in order to be very rich, you need an awful lot of poor people working very hard. And you can tell from what I'm saying what my politics are. So, that's.
I think I can, Pat, and I hope you can tell from mine as well that I'm pretty much of a piece with the way you look at things. And that of course, is something we talk about from every angle. The idea of just presuming that people want more equality is so naive.